Hello again. It's another episode of In Conservation with the Zoom series of interviews, live interviews with some of the movers and shakers in the world of conservation. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and tell everyone about it because there's lots of different conversations for you to watch. Okay, so let me introduce my guest today. He goes by the name of James Macdonald Lockhart. He's an author of two books, the first of which was called Raptor, which was published, I believe, in 2016. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right, 2016, yeah.
And you know what? You scored straight away. You received the Royal Society of Literature Jerwood Award for non-fiction for that book on the first book. Incredible. Incredible. And we are now here talking about your second book called Wild Air. But before we even go any further, listen, James, how are you and where are you?
Oh, well, thanks, David. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for having me on, and hello to everyone who's joined us. Thanks for joining us too. I am at home in Warwickshire, and I have borrowed my teenage son's bedroom just to find somewhere a bit quieter. And yeah, bird news from here. The first bird that I heard this morning when I went out with the dog at dawn was our resident pair of ravens, who they seem to spend the night roosting in the wood, and then just before first light, they move over to a small stand of Scots pine trees, where they take up their perch and start that lovely knocking, clicking sound, talking to each other. So they're the first bird that I hear as I go out in the morning. And actually, it's been like that all winter. They've been there on those Scots pine trees. There was a really cold, bright morning a week or two ago when I tried to record them on my mobile phone, but when I played it back, all I could hear was the dog snuffling around by my feet. Um, and the other birds we've got around here. This afternoon, I went out for a walk and saw a flock of about 100 to 150 fieldfares, which are good numbers for around here. And they've been here for several weeks now. And that's always a wonderful sight, seeing these birds. And they make this fantastic squeaky, chattering sound. And there were a few redwings with them as well. We seem to have here, it alternates. Sometimes we have lots of fieldfares and sometimes lots of redwings. And this winter seems to have been a particularly good year for fieldfares.
Okay, well, two things to say. Firstly, your son's room is very ordered.
Yeah,
I would never, if you hadn't said that it was your son's room, I would never have guessed. You know,
yeah.
when I was a teenage boy, I had posters of people like Diana Ross on the ceiling and things like that. So he seems to be quite ordered, which is quite good. And the raven making a knocking noise. I've never heard that. I have a friend. I call him my Serbian brother. I do a lot of tours in Serbia, and during the spring, sometimes we do tours, or I just go there anyway. And we're walking through the forest, and then the raven flies over, and he goes, "Rah, rah, rah," and the raven starts swooping down to see what's going on. But I've never heard that other call.
Yeah, they seem to have this incredible range of sounds that they make. Everything from knocking, clicking, tapping. It's a extraordinary repertoire, and I find it's that some of the best times to hear it is early in the morning, particularly when it's still, and it seems to be the pair talking to each other, communicating. So there's a great range. I mean, as you say, there's the classic cark sound that they make, but they also have this incredibly rich range of vocalizations that they make. I think there was a study done, I think it was in Switzerland a few years ago, and they recorded around 70 different sounds that ravens were making. So, it's a really rich repertoire.
You
Um,
wouldn't think that from a crow.
no, I know, and it can also be that the sounds they make can also be quite sort of tender and musical sounding as well. Again, you wouldn't expect that from a big corvid like a raven, but they can make some very beautiful, almost musical sounds.
Yeah, that actually, now you think of, now you mention that, now I think about that actually, that is possibly, I mean, I hear that's believable for me, shall I say? Because I've heard jays and magpies suddenly break into some sort of little warble, a little ditty
Mm.
under their breath, and I think, is that you? Wow, why don't you do that more often? Yeah, so yeah. Anyway, we don't know each other. We've not met before. I'm looking forward to the pleasure of meeting you one day. But just a brief sort of reading up on you. I note that you kind of had nature in your history for some time, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. I so I I grew up being very exposed to nature and the countryside, and I spent a lot of time, particularly walking and exploring the hills and mountains in Scotland. I was brought up in the Ochil Hills in central Scotland, and during those walks, I encountered lots of birds along the way, and that definitely sowed a seed for later on in life when I became more interested in birds. But yeah, I mean the other thing that I grew up with was the books and photographs of my great grandfather, who's a Highland naturalist called Seaton Gordon. He lived a long life and he published nearly 30 books. So they took up a lot of space at home, and so I was very aware of his work and his presence. I've got a few of them here actually. I can show you. This was his the first book he ever published. Is called Birds of the Loch and Mountain. I think it was 1912. And then there's another book which was very important to me. This is Hill Birds of Scotland, again published a few years later. And so yeah, I grew up surrounded by his work, and as I got older, I started to read his books, became very captivated by the worlds he described, the birds he worked with and described. And from there, I started to read books by other authors who've been influenced by him and followed in his wake, if you like. I've also got a few of the. So he was, as well as a writer, he took photographs of the birds that he studied, and some of these photographs were amongst the first that were taken. This was at the beginning of the 20th century of some of these birds. So you can see this one here. This is of a pair of greenshank.
Let's lift up a bit higher.
Yeah,
Yeah.
pair of greenshank, just as they're exchanging incubation duty on the nest. Amazing photograph, because this would have been a split-second moment, and that he managed to record that moment when they changed over is incredible, I think. And then another of the birds that he studied a lot was golden eagles, and you see this one here, a pair of golden eagles on the nest. So yeah, so growing up, he was a really a really important influence on me and on my love of nature and birds in particular. So I was very, very fortunate having
Yeah.
having his presence around.
Yeah, you're very fortunate. I mean, I mean, when we spoke before doing this, I was almost jealous of you, thinking, I wish I had that kind of opportunity, to have someone before me to help me kind of get, involved. And who better than your
Yeah.
great grandfather? What an amazing thing. I had an uncle, not an uncle actually, my mum's relative or friend. I can't remember who they were because I was only a kid, but his name was Seaton too, actually.
All right. Huh. Yeah, it's such an unusual name.
It
Huh.
is, but his Seaton spelt with an A.
Right.
Not with a. Do you
Yeah.
remember the first bird you ever saw, by the way?
Um. So I remember the first bird that had a impact on me, which so where we lived in the Ochil Hills, there was this kind of secretive glen, which was really quite hard to get to and hidden. It wasn't very big, and it had a small burn running through it, and there were dippers nesting in the mossy banks of the burn. But every year, a pair of peregrine falcons would nest in the glen on the cliffs there. And I remember walking through the glen, and this would be during the breeding season. The peregrines would come down really low, swooping and screaming at me as I walked up the glen, trying to push me away from their nesting area. And I think that experience with those peregrines was the first, really memorable encounter I had with birds. And when I came to write my book Raptor, and I was thinking back to some of those early experiences. That was the one that that stood out for me, and it was obviously, quite a seminal encounter.
Raptor, just quickly, what was that? Was that an account of all the species found in the UK or something?
Yeah, so that was a book about all 15 of the diurnal birds of prey that breed in the British Isles. And there was a chapter on each species, so 15 chapters. And the book was about the birds, and about going to look for the birds in a different place. It was also about history of the different places that I went to look for them in. And it also, the book became a sort of both a tribute and a mini biography of the 19th century Scottish naturalist William McGilvray. So he was someone who I hadn't set out to write about, but as I was researching the book, I came across his book, Descriptions of the Rapacious Birds of Great Britain. And from there, sort of started to explore his work a bit more. And he published this great History of British Birds, a 5-volume History of British Birds. And he was one of those kind of classic Victorian polymaths. He was also a very gifted artist. He actually worked with Audubon when Audubon came over to Britain to look for subscribers for his Birds of America. He hired McGilvray to help him write up the descriptions of the birds. I just became really fascinated by him, and he started to sort of become much more of a presence in the book. So the book ended up being a lot about McGilvray as well and his work. He was one of the amazing things about him when he was a young man. He was living in Aberdeen at the time, and he was really keen to go and visit the British Museum in London to see the collections of birds that they had there. And didn't have much money at the time, and he just decided, okay, one day I'm going to walk to the British Museum in London. So he walked out of his flat in Aberdeen and just set off walking to London. Went on a very circuitous route through the Highlands to Fort William, and then down through England, eventually arriving at the British Museum and going to look at all the bird specimens there. And he kept a journal of this walk, so that was a real gift to come across that and read that and be inspired by it. Yeah, so that was Raptor. It was about lots of different things, really, about the bird, but also about places, history, and McGilvray as well. And a blend of all those different things.
What an incredible thing to walk all that distance.
Yeah.
Do you remember Norman Wisdom, the comedian, the British comedian, for those who may not know of the name? He, when he started his career, he actually walked from London to Cardiff to get a job.
Yeah, right.
On the shipyards there.
Yeah.
It's amazing that people did that.
Yeah.
McGilvray. I've always had problems pronouncing his name because there's a warbler named after him.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
In North
and that
America.
was, yeah, and I think that was Audubon, who wasn't it, who named it after his friend. I think that's how that came about.
Yeah. Well, I was lucky. I've seen them before, but I guess you've heard that now there is this move to basically quit all eponymous names. And
yeah, I have. Yeah.
How do you feel about Mr. McGilvray losing his warbler?
Yeah, well, it's a shame. I like the story, and it gives you that connection to his relationship with Audubon. So it was a really interesting story. So I think that's it. And I think one of the things I wanted to do writing about him was just kind of make the case for him and restore him a little bit, because I felt he'd sort of almost disappeared from a lot of people's awareness. And so when you lose like a name like that in the bird, then you're also losing a bit of history of the person himself as well.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people arguing about that very thing, so we'll move on from that. Your book, Wild Air. Now, what drew you to this whole thought about song, bird song? I mean, have you always had that kind of ear for it? Where did that come about?
I think there's sort of maybe there's 3 parts to that. And the first actually is going back to Raptor, and that first book that I wrote. And I think this might be the case for quite a lot of writers. The book you write next is often written under the shadow of the previous book. And I certainly felt that with Wild Air. And one of the things I wanted to do with Wild Air was strip back all the other stuff that I'd done in Raptor, the history, Gilvray, and all of that kind of stuff, and just focus on the birds themselves. And so I decided to write about these 8 different species and just write about the birds and not bring in too much other stuff along the way. So that was one of the thoughts and motivations for Wild Air. And the other thing was, I think it was actually the experience of a particular place. I started to visit the Machir, the sand dune pasture, which is found in the Hebrides, particularly on the west side of the Outer Hebrides, and South Uist and Benbecula and North Uist. And when I started going there, I was just astonished really by the abundance of birds. First of all, it was like nowhere else in the British Isles that I'd been to, and particularly the soundscape, the noise that these birds were making, and mostly wading birds, so very vocal birds like oyster catchers, redshanks, snipe, lapwings, and terns. And so there was just this incredible soundscape, and I was just fascinated by this, and started to think about how I'd actually like to try and write about that experience of listening to all these birds in that place. And so actually what I started to do was just focus on the wading birds and try to write about that. I tried to write about the experience of listening to them. And then that started to develop, and I thought actually I'd quite like to bring in different species, and so then I started to think about other species that I might write about. So yeah, so it was that experience of being in a place where there was still this fantastic bird sound in the landscape, which really inspired me into going into researching wild air. And then probably the third thing was going back to Seaton Gordon. Was a story that my granny had told me, that Seaton actually was very deaf, and his deafness was something which came on when he was a young man, still in his 20s. And so he found it very difficult to hear the birds that he studied. And often what he'd do is he'd recruit my granny as his kind of pair of ears. And and the way she described it is that she would scurry ahead of him on their walks, and then she'd report back the songs and the sounds of birds that she could hear. And then often when they got home, what Seaton would do would he'd take out his practice bagpipe chanter. He was as obsessed with bagpipes as he was with birds, and he would then play the song back through his practice bagpipe chanter. And I really loved the story, and I also loved that idea of reporting the songs and sounds back to the reader, so as though I had my granny's role, if you like, in the book. And so that was one of the things I thought I'd try and do with the book, is just report back to the readers what I heard, like my granny used to do to my great granddad. So yeah, I think those kind of 3 different things were quite pivotal in me beginning to shape and put together Wild Air.
Yeah. So your granny must have been quite a good birder by default, surely.
Yeah, I think she was. Yeah, I didn't think she had much choice in it.
So
Yeah.
let's actually talk. I mean, by the way, Wild Air, if you haven't picked it up, if you're reading this or watching this even in the future, get yourself down to a bookshop, buy it, okay? Because it's a great book. It's beautifully written, by the way. And I love the fact that you do focus on 8 species and focus on them very, very meticulously. And we'll talk about a couple of those species a bit later. But for those people watching this and thinking, what is song? Because I get asked that question, if I can get £1 for every time that question's asked of me. And plus, coming up, in May, we have International Dawn Chorus Day, which is, when people, I guess, notice song a bit more. Apart from the fact that when we were locked down, people were hearing birdsong then. Let's discuss what birdsong is, because it's not just there for our enjoyment. It's not about, when you see the films of the past and the animations where the birds are just singing their hearts out, because I'm so happy, and all that sort of stuff. Why do birds sing?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps we should start by just splitting song and sounds too, so that song tends to be longer, more varied, and tends to be performed mostly by male birds in the breeding season, whereas the sounds, vocalisations, are produced by both sexes and tend to be shorter and less structured. So there's sort of two things, and in wild air, you know, I'm drawn to birds as much by their songs as their sounds. So some people would say, well, ravens don't really sing, but they make lots of different interesting sounds. And so, you know, that the book is both about the sounds and the songs. And then, so looking at the song itself, why do birds sing? It's usually thought for two principal reasons. One is to attract a mate, and two, to retain a territory. And some species focus on one of those, and some on the other. And some, I think, for some birds, it's a case of both of those factors being important in the song. Though there are beyond territory retention and attracting mate, there's probably some other more subtle things going on as well with song, like pair bonding is probably something which occurs as well. Song probably also helps with the breeding cycle in terms of the female's ovarian and egg development and things like that, as well as initiating nest building. So there's probably other factors that are at play as well. And then you have, in some birds, you have the females also sing. So, you know, the bird like the dipper, who are right about females sing. And with female song, that's probably more associated with territory defense. And certainly with dippers, it seems to be that female dippers tend to sing at, or focus their song at other female dippers in order to try and discourage them from infiltrating their territory. So yeah, I think those are kind of the basic things that are associated with song. Those main areas: mate attraction, territory defense. Those seem to be things. And song, of course, as everybody experiences, is at its peak for most species during the breeding season. So that's when it's most noticeable. Though there are birds, of course, that sing through the winter as well.
Yeah,
people will hear robins, and you know, we have song thrushes here at the moment just singing their hearts out.
it's interesting because there seems to be a finite amount of different noises a bird can make. Because I could be anywhere in the world and I hear something that sounds familiar. I mean, I've been in North America birding, and I hear something calling in a tree, and everyone's shouting, "Oh, that's a chipping sparrow!" And I'm thinking, that sounds like a cell bunting or lesser whitethroat. You know,
Mm.
there seems to be very sort of slight modifications on a basic theme with many birds, but then some sounds are completely and utterly
Yeah.
strange. I mean, hearing again, going to North America, a bobolink makes a sound which I think is the inspiration behind R2D2. It's that, you know, I can't do it, but it's a real weird
Yeah.
sort of mechanical cranky noise. But you know, there's so much in terms of for oral pleasure in the UK. There's lots of different things, and there's birds like, for me, the great tit, which seem to bring out a different song every year.
Yeah.
And there's the old saying amongst birders that if you hear something calling in the woods that you don't recognise, 9.5 times out of 10, it will be a great tit.
Yeah. In fact, I was listening to a great tit this afternoon singing in the woods. So yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think probably the most successful songsters, or the ones that we celebrate most, are those ones which are able to develop their repertoire, expand it, and bring in other sounds to enhance their repertoire. So you were talking about some birds sounding like other birds, and you know, I certainly experience that all the time. And it could be that sometimes what's occurring there is that mimicry is forming a part of the song, and there are lots of birds who borrow the songs and sounds of other birds and
To
enhance
better
that.
yeah.
And enhance it. Yeah, I think is it the marsh warbler whose song is made up pretty much entirely, I think, of other species birds, you know, and to the extent that I think some ornithologists are able to track the migration routes of marsh warblers by the sounds of other birds that they can detect in the marsh warbler's song. You know, so that if they're stopping off somewhere where there's only a few species of a particular bird, they're able to track the route of the warbler that way, which is, astonishing.
It's phenomenal, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have some recordings for us to hear,
Mm.
which I'm quite keen to listen to, actually. So I just wondered if you can
Yeah.
uh,
So
indulge us.
I'll play these. These are all birds that I write about in the book, and I'll just maybe play the recording, and then I can explain the birds that we listened to at the end. Yeah, I think the main thing with this recording is just to sit back and close your eyes, if you like, and just take in the strangeness, the variety, the beauty, and the music of the sounds, and how varied they are as well. So I'll do that now. Okay.
Right, it's fascinating range of calls. Some of them, I guess, more familiar than others. I mean, I I always love the sound of the lapwing. Before you tell us about them, I just made it made me think about songs and calls in general and how, especially in the past, they were so romantically written about. I mean, you think about the song of the willow warbler, like a cascading waterfall. I mean, I remember reading that as a kid in a book, thinking, what does that sound like? You know, or a golden plover sounds like a young boy's whistle.
Yeah.
What's that? Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. Well, all of the birds that feature in the book, and some, as we talked about earlier, have a whole chapter to them, and some of the others have sort of cameo appearances in the book, as you know, as I counted them, exploring the main species. So the first one we heard was that strange, very loud, almost yodeling call of a black-throated diver, which on a clear day can be heard over 6 miles away. Then we heard a snipe. We were listening to the drumming sound that a displaying snipe makes when it vibrates its stiffened tail feathers. And then there was the skylark, that incredibly rapid, varied song which skylarks perform during their song flights when the males rise up straight above their breeding territories. And then the raven, the bird that we've talked about earlier on, making that loud, classic croaking call, one of the many different sounds that they make. And we could also hear just faintly the ravens whooshing wing beats at the end of that recording. And then the next bird was the Manx shearwater, and that weird noise. It really was a bird and not the sound of a goblin being throttled. And then we heard Dipper, sweet, quiet song, and we could also hear the sound of flowing water behind the Dipper's song. And then Nightjar, very rapid, whirring sound known as churring that nightjars make at dusk and dawn. And then Lapwing, that classic electric bubbling song, followed slightly faintly by the lapwing's wing music, the sound much like a snipe that lapwings produce when they vibrate their outer primary feathers. And then Nightingale, famous songster with its sweet, loud, whistling notes. And then a stone curlew, that rather haunting sound of a pair of stone curlews calling to each other. And then woodcock, eroding woodcock's high-pitched squeak and frog-like croak. And then after the woodcock was, song thrush, the last bird. And because I love hearing its song so much, I gave that one the longest appearance on those recordings.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a real range there.
Yeah, you talked about it in your book, but how can birds like the skylark sing for so long? I mean, they're tiny. They've got tiny buds.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's extraordinary. I think that the best way of answering that is to look at the anatomy of birds. In particular, their what they have something called a syrinx, which is the equivalent of our larynx, our voice box, and the syrinx in birds is located a bit further down the trachea from our larynx, and importantly, it differs from a larynx in a mammal because it has two parts to it, has two chambers. And the way that birds like skylarks can sing for so long and such varied, intricate songs is that they can utilize both chambers as they're singing. So they can sing the same sounding notes at the same time from each chamber, or they can sing a completely different note at the same time as another note in the other side of the chamber. So that's why you get this extraordinary complex repertoire in birds like skylarks and song thrushes and nightingales as well. So that seems to be the really key component in complex bird songs, is that is the anatomy of their voice box, of their syrinx.
Yeah. I mean, this is not a spoiler alert, but I want to talk about the beginning of your book when you open up with the nightjar, and I was heartened when I started reading that, because you were in an area just on the edge of London, which is, unlikely place for most people finding nightjars. that being said, I did remember, as I told you, going to Twitch, a European nightjar that was singing its heart out during the night, but outside at I think Teddington railway station, in the middle of suburbia, and it was on the road outside, and sometimes on top of the car singing. It was like surreal. But then when you think about
Amazing.
it, a lot of nightjars around the world, well, when I say a lot, there's a fair proportion of them actually occur in urban areas anyway. So
Yeah,
I guess
yeah,
that's
yeah.
not unusual amongst the family, but certainly for us in the UK, that was a weird thing. But anyway, you went and listened to a nightjar. Tell us about nightjars because they are such mysterious birds that not all of us have seen or even may have heard of.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't expect to see one at all, and the reason is that they're just probably the most perfectly camouflaged bird that we have in these islands, certainly. And they resemble, they're about the length of a brick, and their plumage resembles bark and the lichen that you'd find on a rock, and so that they are able to perfectly blend into the heath or woodland floor, which they spend most of their time in during the breeding season. Or classically, they'll also line themselves up on the branch of a tree and just blend into the tree almost perfectly. Yeah, I mean they're fascinating birds. They have a very rich folklore history. It was thought some years ago that they would um, um, cause disease in cattle and goats because they were often seen flying around livestock, particularly in the evening, and so this association developed where they were causing illnesses in these livestock. But in fact, what the nightjars were doing was just predating the insects, which would gather around uh, the animals, and so and also because of their association with nighttime, with darkness when they're most active. There was also this association with kind of evil spirits and satanic things like that. Um, and yeah, what's particularly striking about them is that they just have this extraordinary song, this whirring sound, which we heard later on. And it sounds almost like a kind of a generator going off, whirring round and round and round. And it's the sheer kind of length of the song, which is just incredible. It will go on and on for minutes on end, and it seems like the bird is hardly drawing breath at all as they're singing. So yeah, this place that I've managed to find, this bit of heathland, probably about 15 kilometers or so southwest of Heathrow. And I was just really fortunate in that it seemed to be a perfect place for the birds, and I would go there, get myself there in the evening and wait for darkness, and then the nightjars would start up and start to chirp. The thing they had to compete with there was the sounds both of motorways and busy roads, but mainly the aircraft coming into land at Heathrow Airport. So every now and again, a plane would come in really low, and all the nightjars would seem to stop singing, and then they'd start up again as soon as the planes had passed.
I remember as a kid, 13 years old, my first trip out of London, youth hosteling in Scotland, and I was on the sleeper train,
Mm.
and I didn't go to sleep. I was so excited. I was just had my head stuck out the window the whole 17 hours or whatever it was. I remember being in Carlisle, and the train stopped to get some post put on it. And whilst it stopped, I was hearing this really strange noise. I was thinking, what is that noise? It just kept on going. And then I forgot about it. And actually, as it happened, I went to a reserve near Aviemore in the Cairngorms. And I remember walking through this birch forest, and all of a sudden, something flew up and landed on the branch, but lengthways as opposed to
Yeah,
across it. And I was thinking, what's that? you know. So it's only afterwards I realised I've just seen my first nightjar, and a couple of years later I realised, oh, I heard my first nightjar as well. So
oh yeah,
it
yeah.
was a great discovery. But one thing I will say, and I totally agree with you, the camouflage of a nightjar is amazing. What I don't understand is birds like snipe, who are equally camouflaged, you know, but they don't trust their camouflage. I mean, they've been doing it for eons, and you're walking through a field, and then suddenly one flies up. If you hadn't have flown up, I wouldn't have seen you. Stay
Yeah, yeah. And snipe also, you see them perched on fence posts as well, don't you? So you can see their whole profile on the fence post, that long bill pointed downwards. Yeah, yeah.
But there is something magical about nightjar. I mean, you know, as you say, they used to be the goat suckers, weren't they? They were called goat suckers.
Yeah.
Um, absolutely fabulous. So, what else can you tell us about these birds? Because
Well, yeah, I mean, they the other thing, the other effect of listening to them, the way I describe it in the book is that it's a bit like going to a ventriloquist's conference, because it's very difficult to know where the birds are actually that are calling, and they seem to have this ability to almost kind of throw their song, so that the listener is very confused as to where the bird actually is, and that seems to be an anti predator behavior, so that they're able to sing their song on their perches, but confuse any predator nearby as to their actual location. And so that was something that I definitely experienced when I listened to them. It was really confusing, knowing where they were. I mean, the other thing that I found, this was researching the books, that I found was that they are, to a large extent, they're kind of moon birds, if you like. They're lunophilic. They depend on the light of the moon to do their maximum amount of hunting. So they're not like bats who can detect their prey through echolocation. They do require some degree of light to isolate their prey, which are mostly moths and beetles and true flies. But when there is moonlight, that obviously helps them hugely to locate their prey, and they will actually synchronize their breeding cycle so that their young are in the nest and being fed at the period when there is most moonlight, so that they can then utilize that to catch as much food as they can to provide for their young. I mean, the flip side of that is that whilst they do depend on some light to hunt by, too much light can be extremely harmful for them. So that where there is habitat which is encroached by artificial light, then that can cause lots of problems for them, because it kind of creates this glare effect and just blinds the birds, so they can't isolate their prey at all. And places where I think particularly in Switzerland, they did a study. It seems that nightjars have declined hugely there, and the reason seems to be artificial light, and how that's encroached on their territories. So they're very kind of light. They're very light sensitive birds. So yeah, there's so much that's fascinating about them. Really, really interesting birds. Magical.
that's what I love about your book. I mean, there's so much information there, and plus each species kind of represents a different type of habitat.
Mm.
You know, so it's all very, very different birds and very different habitats. And the other thing I loved about your book, by the way, James, is the fact that you mentioned one of my heroes of ornithology. He's a man that goes by the name of Eric Sims,
Mm.
who I had the pleasure of meeting when he was alive, obviously, in the 90s when I met him at the British Birdwatching Fair. For those who don't know, Eric Sims was a prolific writer. He was a sound recordist for the BBC. He wrote a million books. He inspired me with one of them, which is Birds of Town and Suburb.
Mm.
And I remember meeting him and my knees were knocking. That's
Mm.
how much of a
Mm.
hero he was to me.
What an amazing thing! What an amazing thing to meet him. Yeah, I mean, what I write about in the book is this radio project which he organized. I think this must have been back in the 1950s, where he um, decided to record birds across the British Isles at dawn in spring, and to see when different species began to sing, at what time they began to sing. So he recorded birds up in the northeast of Scotland, birds in the borders, and then in Lancashire, Wales, and down in the south of England. And so you got the first bird singing right up in the north of Scotland, where there was most light, and then gradually, the dawn chorus starts to move south and west as the sun comes up. And it was a kind of beautifully conceived project, I thought, and it really resonated with me. And he was kind of meticulous in the times that each species began to sing, and I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, and when he died, his daughter contacted me and said that she thought that I would like to have his desk copy of Birds of Town and Suburbs. So I got his book with his
Oh wow,
notes.
yeah,
That's my treasure. Place goes up in flames. I'm rescuing that before anything else.
yeah, fantastic. What a thing to have. Yeah, I mean, I mean, Eric Sims is a one of the many ornithologists who I drew on and was inspired researching the book. And in many ways, the book is both an account of my own experiences observing the birds, like nightjars on the heath outside London, but also researching those who had studied them intently as ornithologists and naturalists. And as much as I relished the experience of observing the birds, I also found myself kind of sort of falling in love with the science as well and the ornithology. And there are so many moments like the Eric Sims radio project that I discovered in the ornithological literature, which I just found so inspiring and I really relished writing about. Another good example of that, those kind of things that you come across in the literature is when I was researching skylarks, I came across this research that had been done on how skylarks, not only, we were talking earlier about how song is used to attract mates and retain territory, but with skylarks, it's both that, but also it seems that skylarks use their song as a way to deter predators, and in particular, their principal avian predator, the merlin. And what's been observed is that when a merlin pursues a skylark, and they do this through the air on these kind of fast twisting aerial chases, is that those skylarks that start to sing loudly and vigorously will often signal to the merlin to actually abandon the pursuit. And so what's thought to be occurring is that the skylark is signaling to the merlin through its song that it is fit and has the stamina to outlast this race, and it's not in the merlin's interest to continue with it. So both the skylark and the merlin benefit from that communication exchange. The merlin doesn't waste energy pursuing the skylark lives to sing another day. And that's I thought that was just fascinating research. And that the idea behind it is just it's kind of beautiful that here is the skylark singing literally to survive. And so there was another aspect of song, the purpose of song that we didn't touch on earlier. But for some species it can be much more it can be applied in other ways beyond the traditional mate and territory defense.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible when you hear about that. The Skylark is probably Britain's most famous songster, would you say? I mean, it's been written about by everyone,
Yeah.
that's anyone. What do you think? Why do you think people were captivated? I remember reading in your book about people thinking that they flew like incredible
Yeah,
heights to
yeah.
see.
I think it's because they combine their song display. They combine display with their song. I think that's what captivates people. So they, for such a small bird, it shoots up straight up, using its wings to get up rather than soaring like most birds do to gain height. Shoots up to I think the average song flight for a skylark is around 400 meters, something like that. So it's a considerable height. And then it manages to hold itself in the air and sing at the same time. And it's that combination of things, I think, which was fascinating and mesmerizing to watch. And then, actually for me, the song flight was always spectacular, but the thing I loved seeing most was when they actually drop down out of the song flight, because they come down and they'll sort of hover a bit and then drop down a bit more. And then suddenly down they'll go. They'll come down, and often just as they get to the top of the field, they'll level out onto this into level flight, and then often prompt other skylarks to come up out of the ground as well. And there'll be skirmishes and chases around the field. So beyond that traditional song flight display, there's actually also lots of other things going on with song flights. And I find that when I started to look down at the ground, there were also lots of fascinating things going on there, the way that they moved around and chased each other, and that you'd see birds sometimes singing actually just from perches on tops of the crop as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in Spain, so my experiences of skylark these days are as winter visitors in flocks flying over fields, and you hear them chirping, but that's about it. You don't hear they're singing at all. So that's one of the things I miss about the English spring. We can just finally kind of talk about one other of your chosen birds, and it happens to be one of my favourite songsters. It always brings the hairs up the back of my neck when I hear it, especially in places where I don't expect, such as my local patch in London, Wormwood Scrubs in West London, surrounded by urbanity, surrounded by people with their dogs everywhere. But very occasionally in the spring, one of these birds passes through and may sing just for morning. And I'm talking about nightingales. Again, another very famous songster, a bird that unfortunately has declined phenomenally in the UK. Which is very sad. And in fact, I've heard very few in the UK actually, but then I haven't actually, apart from the ones in my local patch, I've never actually really gone to listen to them elsewhere. Why is a nightingale so evocative?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Well, for me, it was not it was unlike any other bird in terms of the volume and the range of sounds that they made. And actually, when I because of the reasons that you've just outlined, it took me a long time to find somewhere where there were nightingales still. And eventually I did find this wood where it was a small population, and I had lots of attempts to try and find them, and would go there in the evening and hear lots of song thrushes. And actually the song thrushes in this wood imitated nightingales. So sometimes I would get a bit confused and think, well, was that a nightingale? And actually that was always a song thrush. But eventually managed to find a singing bird. And yeah, it was unlike anything else. It was there was that kind of sort of liquid clarity to the song, which I hadn't heard in any other bird. That sort of really piercing quality, which the best way to describe it, I think, is that you kind of you sort of feel the song in your bones. It's almost as if it kind of vibrates through you rather than just hearing it through your ears. So there's a kind of physical reaction to the song for me. So yeah, so it's very special. It just has this quality to it which really gets inside you. That was my experience of it. Why have people? Why have so many people responded to Nightingale's song? I think probably it's a lot to do with cultural reasons, and that they've been so long associated with, particularly with poetry, but also with music. And so I think it has that, it has that kind of resonance in people's mind, that they hear as something special and that is a part of our culture. And then also now, just as you said, there's a kind of added sense of poignancy as well, because it's not a song that you hear, certainly in this part of England where I live, much at all anymore. So to experience it was very, very special. It really was. Yeah.
They are absolutely fabulous birds. You have obviously had your ancestry embedded in nature. Is this going to be carrying on with your son? Is your son a birder? Is your son listening out for stuff? Is your son a budding writer?
Yeah, it was actually twins, so there's two of them.
Oh, okay. Are your
Yeah,
sons?
yeah. So, well, a bit like my granny with my great grandfather Seaton Gordon, they don't have a lot of choice, so they have to come along with me on a lot of these trips. And I did take one of them back to the Manx Shearwater colony on the Isle of Rum. So I went there and spent a lot of time there. We went back, and one of the boys really wanted to come with me, and we he's just 11 years old at the time, and we have to walk up the mountain. Have you been to the colony there on Rum?
No.
No. So, yeah, it's quite a long walk up into the mountains, and we walked and got really wet. The weather was terrible, and at halfway there, I said to him, "Look, we don't have to do this. We can go back and go and get into some dry clothes." And he was determined to carry on. And we got up to where the colony is and got our tent up, soaking wet, and got in. And he just had enough by then. He got into his sleeping bag and went to sleep. Anyway, at about sort of 1 o'clock in the morning, when all the shearwaters came in and started making this extraordinary noise, he woke up, and I was about to go out the tent to listen to him a bit more. He said, "Oh, I've heard them, Dad, don't worry." Yeah, he said his description was they sound like cackling bandits, and then he went back to sleep. So yeah, they've come along with me on these trips, and I think I think they enjoy it, and hopefully some of it seeps in, and it will come back to them later on in life.
Well,
It was a bit like for me.
yeah, well, all I can say for those watching this in the future on YouTube, to watch out for James Macdonald Lockhart's son or sons and their books, mentioning James as one of their inspirations. I can see that coming for sure. What is your favourite bird song, James?
Yeah,
or bird call even. Bird.
yeah, I'm gonna. I think I have to go for the Song Thrush. It's where we are. It's the bird that I hear right through the winter, and that's so special. And the range of its song is always surprising and beautiful and a bit strange, and just there's such a range there which I really admire and really love hearing. And so I heard one this morning. I've heard them in November and December. Yeah, it's a really, really special song, I think.
And if you could be anywhere on this planet right now, where would you be?
Well, I'd have to go for the Macha in the Outer Hebrides, the sand dune pasture that's found out there, and the abundance of birds that it still holds. It's a really special place, really close to my heart. So yeah, I'll go for that.
Yeah, I've yet to visit that place.
Yeah, you must go. It's really special. Yeah, and there's such a dynamism there as well amongst the birds. So you see hen harriers coming in and merlins and getting chased away by all the wading birds. Yeah, fantastic place.
Sounds beautiful. Well, all that's left for me to say is thank everyone for watching this episode of In Conservation With, and don't forget there's a load more to see on the YouTube channel, The Urban Birder World. But if you're watching it on that channel, you know it's there already. But please keep an eye on the Urban Birder World website, where you can see who's coming up next. And they're all fascinating, just like tonight with James. So, James, I'd like to thank you for your time today to talk to us about your book. And I want to wish you the very best with your book, Wild Air. And as I said earlier, if you haven't got it, you need to get it. Make space in your bookshelf for it. So thank you very much, James.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And Zoomers, where would I be without you? Thank you very much for being here today, supporting In Conservation With. And you know what you need to do. Keep looking up. Keep looking up.